Before naira, before the British pound, before any coin with a queen's face on it ever touched African soil, there was a small white shell that Nigerians used to pay for food, land, and even a wife's dowry. It came from thousands of kilometers away in the ocean, and for a while, it worked better than most currencies do today. This is a story of cowrie shell and how one colonial decision quietly wiped it out. Now, let's talk about where the shell came from. The cowrie shell you would find in a Nigerian market 200 years ago didn't come from Nigeria. It came from the Maldives, a chain of islands in the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers away. Historians say the Portuguese brought the first European shipment of cowries from the Maldives to the West African coast in the year 1515. From there, the shell spread inland through trans-Saharan trade routes, after first arriving through Arab traders around the 8th century. By the time it reached what we now call Nigeria, the cowrie wasn't just a pretty shell anymore. It was money, real working money. And it makes sense if you think about what it worked. A cowrie shell doesn't rot, it doesn't break easily. It's small enough to carry in bulk and hard enough that nobody could just make more of it locally. You needed the real thing from the sea. That's actually the same quality that makes gold valuable. Scarcity plus durability. By the 19th century, cowries were used as currency all along the Gulf of Guinea, from Accra in the present-day Ghana through the Niger Delta and as far inland as northern Nigeria, Niger, and Mali. This wasn't a small local thing. It was a currency system that connected millions of people across different kingdoms, different languages, different rulers, all agreeing that this one shell had value. Now, what people actually used this shell for? People use the cowries the same way we use naira notes today. You would count out a certain number of shells for a bag of grain, a larger number for a piece of cloth, and for a bigger transaction, land, cattle, dowry payment, it would take thousands of shells, sometimes strung together in bundles, so you didn't have to count one by one. Cowries were used for everyday transactions, rituals, and even marriage payment across Nigerian communities. It wasn't just an economic tool either. In a lot of these societies, cowries also carried spiritual and cultural meaning. They showed up in shrines, in ceremonies, not just in marketplace. But here is a part of this story that we have to be honest about, because it's real history and hiding it doesn't help anyone. Cowries were also used as part of the payment system in the transatlantic slave trade. European traders brought shiploads of cowries specifically to exchange along the West African coast, and some of what was purchased with them, historians confirm, included people. Cowries were the currency for transactional exchange for anything from objects to people. This is an uncomfortable fact, but it's an important one, because it tells you something about why Europeans cared so much about cowries in the first place. It wasn't culture, it was trade, and trade at that time in that region was tied up with the slave trade in ways that shaped everything that came after, including the story we are about to tell you. Now, when the shell started losing value, Now, here is where it gets interesting and where you start to see a pattern that repeats in almost every currency story we will ever tell you on this channel. As European demand for African goods grew through the 19th century, traders began importing much larger quantities of cowries shells into West Africa, bringing in a different, more abundant species from Zanzibar to add to the original ones from the Maldives. Think about what that means in plain terms. Imagine you are a trader and you know the local people accept cowries as payment. What's stopping you from just bringing in boatloads after boatloads of shells and using them to buy up goods cheaply? Nothing was stopping them, and they did exactly that. The result had a name at that time. Historians called it Cowrie inflation of the 19th century, and it drove up the cost of using cowries as a medium of exchange. This is the same story as Zimbabwe's $1 trillion note, the same story as Weimar Germany's wheelbarrows of cash. When you flood any currency system with more units than the economy actually needs, the value of each unit drops. It happened with paper money in the 20th century. It happened with a seashell in the 19th century. The only difference is, in this case, it wasn't Nigeria's own government causing the flood. It was foreign traders doing it on purpose for their own benefits. Now, the British moved in. By the late 1800s, the British had shifted from being traders on the coast to being the actual government of the territory that would become Nigeria. And a government that controls a country wants to control the money in that country too. In 1903, the British introduced bronze coins into Nigeria and placed a ban on any further importation and circulation of cowries, along with two other traditional currencies, manilas and copper wire currency. Later, in 1908, the British went further and introduced pennies, half pennies, and 1/10 of a penny coins. This wasn't gradual and it wasn't neutral. This was a deliberate policy decision. By around 1900, colonial governments were already showing hostility towards shell currency, and colonial officials, driven by a strong belief in fixed exchange rate, tried to fix official rate between the cowries and their own currency in the years just before World War I. Let's that sink in for a second. They didn't just introduce a new currency and let people choose. They bound the old one. Ask yourself, why would any government do that? The answer is simple, and it's the same answer in almost every colonial economy across Africa at the time: taxation. If people are trading in cowries and cowries have no value outside the local economy, the colonial government cannot easily collect taxes in a currency it can use internationally. But if you force people to pay tax in British coin, a currency you control the supply of, and you force people to go and earn British coin, and the fastest way to earn British coin, if you are a Nigerian farmer or a laborer at that time, is to work for colonial economy. Cash crops, colonials project, wage labor under British terms. Banning the cowrie wasn't really about modernizing the economy. It was about pulling people into a system the British could tax and control. Now, the slow death. It didn't disappear overnight. Around 1900, shell money was still circulating widely across much of its old territory, even though it was already in decline, with British silver coin having already replaced cowries along the coast for most transactions, apart from the smallest ones in market. But once the ban was official, And once colonial tax policy forced British currency into daily life, the cowries days were numbered. Cowries, once used for everyday transactions, rituals, and marriage payment, were pushed into a second role, with their importance in economic life gradually fading. By the time Nigeria became independent in 1960, the cowries wasn't money anymore. It was history, a cultural symbol, something you would see at a traditional wedding, not something you would use to buy garri at the market. Today, you would see cowries in traditional ceremonies, in jewelry, even on runways and album covers, because the shell never lost its cultural meaning, even after it lost its economic power. But that's exactly the point. What used to be real money became decoration, and that transition didn't happen by accident. It happened by policy. Now, what does this actually teach us? So, what do we actually learn from a issue that stopped being money over 100 years ago? First, whoever controls the currency controls the people. That's not a slogan. That's exactly what happened here. The British didn't need to conquer every village. They just needed to make sure the money in your pocket was money they controlled. Second, a currency is only as strong as the discipline behind its supply. The cowrie didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It failed partly because foreign traders flooded the market with more shells than the economy could handle, and partly because a new ruling power had every incentive to replace it. And third, this pattern didn't end with cowrie. We are going to see this exact same story again when we talk about the naira's own devaluation decades later. Different currencies, same forces. If you want to see how this same pattern played out with Nigeria's own currency, from 1 naira being more than $1 to where we are today, that video is coming right after this one. Subscribe to our channel because money has a history, and that history explains a lot more about today than most people realize. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video. Bye.